The cosmos is a vast, inhospitable place, what with all the black holes, collapsing stars, and especially those pesky old ones. But if you'd like to explore a brand new cosmic empire, then look no further than the neo-gothic acid trip that is Diluvian Ultra, a high-octane first-person shooter from Cresthelm Studios and Fulcrum Publishing, who's sponsoring today's video. In Diluvian Ultra, you play as the warrior Prince Attila, who's awakened from his space slumber aboard his tomb ship by a mysterious enemy, which is cause enough for him to take up a sword and cut a bloody swath to the heart of the problem. To survive, you'll need to use your double jump, air dash, or ground slam, and 6 different weapons to stay one step ahead of the 13 unique enemy types throughout 10 different levels, all the while altering Attila's abilities with 30 different upgrades. Chapter 1 is now out on Steam, GOG, and EGS at the low price of $9.99, with more set to come, so if you're hankering to step into the crimson carapace of Attila, hit the link in the description or the pinned comment below. Thanks again to Diluvian Ultra for the sponsorship. Without further ado, let's start the show. Welcome back, ghouls and/or ghosts, to another sanity-dispelling, fishy-smelling episode of What Happened, the pop culture show that bores its damp claws deep into the darkest, most forbidden development stories. Since it's once again that very special time of the year, I thought it appropriate to enter the madness of the Lovecraft mythos and one of its most infamous video game adaptations. It's a terrifying tale of stubborn technology, a revolving door of publishing partners, and an arduous 7+ year long development cycle. So grab your faded notebooks and Yithian energy weapons as I answer the question, what happened to Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth? Dagon. Things start relatively sanely with AdventureSoft Publishing, a British company who mainly released the extremely British Simon the Sorcerer series of point-and-click adventure titles, which were largely attributed to father and son team Mike and Simon Woodruff. In 1998, the Woodruffs founded a dedicated development studio under AdventureSoft Publishing named Headfirst Productions, with the first game being, what else but Simon the Sorcerer 3D.
After 3 games, it's about bloody time.
Soon enough, though, larger, more unknowable ideas were forming on the edges of their minds, with family-friendly sorcery giving way to more arcane aspirations. Early into the development of Simon 3D, a designer by the name of Andrew Brazier created a Usenet thread on the alt.horror.cthulu newsgroup simply titled, "What would you want to see in a Cthulhu computer game?" Yes, that typo is accurate. But thankfully, users understood the assignment and began a lively conversation about the things they'd like to see, including first-person perspectives, stealth gameplay, and even a multiplayer option. In issue 172 of Eurogamer magazine, Andrew Brazier discussed how important he felt this early feedback had been. Back then, it was the easiest way to get in touch with dedicated fans, and I learned very quickly that mythos had a large and passionate following. I got a lot of good suggestions regarding what should or shouldn't be in the game, and even some suggesting the very idea of a Lovecraft video game was sacrilege. The challenge was to make something that would interest Cthulhu fans and also attract a new audience, plus ensuring the final game was actually fun to play. The idea of then crafting a game based on Lovecraft's writings had taken hold at Headfirst, and while getting Simon's first 3D adventure out the door would be their immediate priority, Headfirst co-founder Mike Woodruff had struck a deal with tabletop RPG company Chaosium to secure the official Call of Cthulhu license, affording the team access to a wealth of lore and imagery of which to draw upon. One slight issue with that, though, was finding appropriate material and scenarios within Lovecraft's writings which would translate well to video games. In multiple interviews, Andrew shared some observations on Lovecraft's writing, like this one from GameSpot. The original stories don't translate into a game that well because the main protagonists would tend, when confronted by a monster, to go totally insane, die of fright, or turn and run as fast as possible in the opposite direction. Whilst this is true in the mythos, it wouldn't make for a very interesting game. Active development on the project initially kicked off with Simon Woodruff stepping into the director's chair, and it's here where Dark Corners of the Earth took much of its early shape. Innsmouth became one of the main locales, and its residents became the main antagonistic force, at least in the early game, which was a given due to that famous and unnerving Innsmouther look.
If you don't like it, just turn around and leave.
Andrew cited the clear description of its resident fishmen as a much stronger foundation to build off of than many of the more vague or abstract Lovecraft critters found in his other works. Quick sidebar here though, before we move on. Please note that while we do our best to get everything right, the timeline we've covered thus far has been a bit vague, as the Usenet thread was posted on June 9th, 1999, with the first screenshots of the game apparently posted on GameSpot on December 21st that same year. Though GameSpot's content seems completely lost to time, we could still confirm the screenshots existed as early as January 8th, 2000 on other outlets like IGN, alongside the game's initial announcement and its very optimistic Q3 2001 release date. Given that timeline, it seems likely that the Call of Cthulhu licensing discussion and possibly even early development was actually well underway before the Usenet thread had been made, but we don't know for sure. So for now, know that the timeline here is appropriately hazy and vague, like any good Lovecraft tale. Anyways, back to our story. One of Brazier's first tasks on Cthulhu as a technical artist was figuring out how to best achieve the atmosphere the team were aiming for within a 3D engine, which in the late 90s and early 2000s was a bit of a mystery in and of itself. There were very few fully featured solutions for things like lighting, physics, and other graphical elements, all problems the team would need to solve, which of course ushered in the first stormy clouds, which would lead to a maelstrom of further nightmares. With the beginnings of Dark Corners of the Earth coming together, including the smart choice to increase atmosphere and immersion by dispensing with traditional HUD elements like health and ammo, Headfirst were able to attract their first publishing partner, tabletop game giant Ravensburger. After what was described in the Eurogamer piece as a long, protracted negotiations period, the project was then shuffled off to one of Ravensburger's two video game publishing arms. The first of the two specialized in family-friendly titles. I don't think that would have worked. So, the relevant duties fell on the second, Fish Tank Interactive, who published titles for the older crowd, including several I've never heard of, except for maybe Aquanox and Swine. But Headfirst started to run headfirst into technical problems, trying to bring their vision of a Lovecraftian world to digital life. The then cutting-edge Havok physics engine, which wasn't even called Havok yet, was chosen to govern the game's physics, while NetImmerse was used for pretty much everything else. Now, why did I use that inflection on NetImmerse? Well, that's because you might remember it from our Prince of Persia 3D episode, as it was the name that the Gamebryo engine went by until 2003. Gareth Clark, a programmer who joined Headfirst around that time, told Eurogamer that both tech solutions had their own problems. We were finding all sorts of issues with Havok at the time, no negativity towards it, but it was in its infancy and we just couldn't get it to do what we needed it to. NetImmerse wasn't robust in terms of a game engine, unless you were running at 60 frames a second. By today's standards, 60 frames would be fine, but on the original Xbox and PCs of the time, you were looking at 30. I'm not 100% clear what the frame rate mentions were referring to in that quote. Maybe the tools had issues at lower performance targets? Regardless, NetImmerse was problematic enough to get an explicit mention in an interview over a decade later, so it must have indeed proved to be problematic. Then, in a pre-E3 2001 story published by GameSpot, which would be the first of 5 pre-E3 stories about Cthulhu, by the way, the game was said to be at around 70% complete, with a revised QT 2002 release date. Still optimistic, I see. Then, once Simon 3D finally shipped, Headfirst were free to fully focus all their mental energies on our darling dreaming Cthulhu. But things were about to take another unfortunate turn. A company named Joe Wood Interactive bought out Ravensburger's video game publishing arm. This might have been cause for concern at the start, but when you looked at Joe Wood's publishing history, which contained the likes of Arx Fatalis, Silent Storm, and Gothic 2, it actually didn't paint that bad of a picture for Cthulhu. In a cruel twist of fate, though, Headfirst announced they were terminating their publishing contract with Ravensburger due to an alleged breach of contract. This was followed by Ravensburger's "nuh-uh/we'll see you in court" response about a week later. We don't know exactly what transpired here, but at the end of the day, it resulted in Dark Corners of the Earth being left without a reliable source of funding. Headfirst and Call of Cthulhu then soldiered on until eventually its original director Simon Woodruff stepped away from it to oversee other in-development titles. This was a bit of a strategic move on Headfirst's part though, since most of the design and levels on Dark Corners of the Earth were already in place. It was just a matter of ironing out the technical issues, polishing, bug squashing, etc. The studio decided to splinter off to start up future projects in the meantime, and the plan seemed to be going all in on Lovecraft. One of these future projects would be a direct sequel to Dark Corners named Call of Cthulhu Destiny's End, which was targeted for both the PS2 and Xbox. It was more of a traditional third-person survival horror experience. Funnily enough, this wasn't even the original plan, as Destiny's End actually started life as a PS2 exclusive they were planning since 2002, subtitled Tainted Legacy, but then was retrofitted to become a sequel to Dark Corners, taking place some 80 years later. But it doesn't end there, as another team started work on Call of Cthulhu Beyond the Mountains of Madness. It was not only based on Lovecraft's famous novella In the Mountains of Madness, it was meant to be a follow-up to it. It was being developed for the Xbox and PC, and would have retained the first-person perspective of Dark Corners of the Earth. This was all done while still not having a confirmed publisher on board, which is just so unhinged. Then, in 2003, Unlikely Saviors stepped out of the fog, Bethesda Softworks, and 2K Games, who saw the potential in what Headfirst were trying to achieve and took it under a new publishing deal. There was just one little caveat though: an Xbox port would have to become the top priority, with the PC version that Headfirst had been developing all along to be placed on the back burner. The small team were already struggling with their choice of middleware technology, so to then throw a mandatory console version on top only slowed the process down even further. Not to mention making two other fully fledged console horror games at the same time, so it fell to designer Chris Gray to more or less salvage what they had on Dark Corners to finally get it shipped. He shared what his responsibilities entailed with Eurogamer. It was my job to revise and edit the game to something shorter. The original plan had been 40 hours, and then add in all the detail and dialogue coordination with the rest of the design team. Now, you might recall that historically, whenever companies start designing or announcing sequels for games that aren't even close to coming out yet, like these little gems right here, well, it almost always results in the same grim outcome, a tradition proudly carried on by Call of Cthulhu. Even though Headfirst already had their tentacles full juggling two versions of the same game, Bethesda also started pushing for a PlayStation 2 port of Dark Corners, something that the team politely scoffed at. We said no chance, so they outsourced it. I recall an awkward conversation when the other developer phoned up and asked us questions on its feasibility. They'd tried everything, but it was clear it would never happen. It had half the memory of the Xbox, so the tech was just hopelessly compromised. So, due to all the tech problems and the skeleton crew left working on it, progress remained glacial on Call of Cthulhu. Time passed, the seasons changed, GameSpot continued publishing their yearly pre-E3 article on Cthulhu, until finally, during the last week of October 2005, and just in time for the Halloween spooky season, the game slithered onto store shelves. And I wish I could tell you it was a smash hit, I really do, but in reality, Cthulhu saw a very muted launch, which was a disappointment to pretty much everyone at Headfirst. In the Eurogamer piece, Chris Gray recalled the team going down to a local game store and were shocked to see that not only were they not stocking copies of Dark Corners, the store clerk had never even heard of it. So the commercial success of Call of Cthulhu was therefore something of a dark, empty abyss, as I can't find any reliable sales numbers for it, which isn't a good sign. It was mentioned twice in 2K's SEC filings before vanishing completely during the quarter of its release, but beyond that, the only other figure I could find for the Xbox version was an unsourced just over 5,000 sales from a Eurogamer article. Headfirst's madness-inducing baby fared better critically, however, because while outlets did criticize the game's later half, which was largely composed of basic, kinda janky shooting sequences, frustrating stealth mechanics, and a litany of bugs, the dread-filled atmosphere, unique HUD-less perspective, well-written story, and the nail-biting chase through the Innsmouth Hotel were heaped with praise. The PC version was eventually released in April of 2006, though unfortunately didn't fix the issues critics had, and at the time of release some considered it to be even worse due to exciting new PC-only bugs. This was largely out of Headfirst's hands though, because this version of the game was primarily finished by a single employee, Gareth Clark.
Jesus, no. Stop it, you crazy bastard.
There was simply no money left to keep a full team on to polish it. He shared this anecdote with Eurogamer. The PC version very nearly didn't happen, as I was practically the only person left in the building and hadn't been paid for months, but we couldn't stand it not coming out after years of work. Why was there almost no one left? Where did all the money go? Well, once Dark Corners bombed at retail, 2K and Bethesda had no interest in publishing either of the in-development sequel games. In Destiny End's case, it looks to have had more in common with RE4 than anything else, and Hip Games, the publishers of such PS2 classics as Stolen, Garfield, and A Dog's Life, seemed to be attached to publish it at one point, but I guess when the sales numbers, or the lack of sales numbers, came in for Dark Corners, they perhaps got cold feet themselves, and the deal fell through. So, somewhat inevitably, in mid-2006, Headfirst closed its doors, with many of its employees, like Gareth Clark, finding homes at other notable British studios. Nonetheless, Gareth leaves us with his happier thoughts on the game over 10 years on from its release, via Eurogamer. It's without a shadow of a doubt my favorite game I've worked on because of the way the team gelled together and the original nature of it. No other game has had its longevity. Every year I see it in lists of top 10 games no one ever played or great games for Halloween. It's a bit of a curiosity, and in some respects I prefer that it was a commercial failure yet a cult success, because it shaped my enthusiasm for the industry. Fans have since tried to polish and fix the PC version in subsequent years, but it's still not quite there yet. And considering the love that many Lovecraft enthusiasts still have for it, Steam Spy numbers, which can admittedly be a bit inaccurate, do have it pegged at around 289,000 copies sold, so it makes me feel that this game is one that could use a little night dive. But the weirdest part about all of this, though, is the bizarre web of connections that have spread throughout multiple games that have featured the octopus-faced old one. Frogwares, the makers of the Sherlock Holmes series, were contracted to develop another official Call of Cthulhu game back in 2014, only for the reins of development to be snatched away from them and be given to Cyanide Studios, who produced the very divisive 2018 title, which tried and failed to recapture the essence of Headfirst's work. Even more bizarrely still, Frogware's own Lovecraftian game, The Sinking City, had a development and release that was so fractured I've covered it on the show before, which you can check out here. It just seems that regardless of the year or hardware, there's always a prevailing, cursed, fetid ichor that efflues out of the crustaceous, cacodemonical carnal house of Cthulhu game development, which is oh so very Lovecraft. If you know of any other tenebrous tales of game development, do let me know in the comments below or enter the dark temples of my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!